The Tigers send Javon Pickett out on a high note. Plus, Robin Pingeton gives her explanation that I'm not quite buying for Aijha Blackwell's limited minutes this past week, and also some Missouri football news as well right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hail, you true sons and daughters. I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. And I don't know about you, but it was just refreshing, at least from my perspective. Maybe it was just me getting caught up in the emotion of senior day, but at least for one afternoon, to me, none of the noise about Cuonzo Martin really mattered. It was just a basketball game that the fans in attendance, you could tell they really wanted it for Missouri and for Javon Pickett in particular, especially when it was 51-all at the under 12-minute mark. You know, I just really realized it wasn't the biggest crowd of the season, of course. Haven't been a lot of big crowds this season, but you know what? People were into it, and I think a big reason for that, at least from my perspective, I don't know, the emotion of senior day, that whole thing, it just all works. Seeing Javon come out with his parents, it just, I don't know, I love it. What can I say? You feel like this kid you just got to know over the last 4 years, just to see the finality of it all, and of course to get a big victory for him, and a guy obviously playing probably his best basketball here the last semester or so. So congrats to Pickett on what's probably a good career. Now, of course, technically Javon could come back. There is talk that, oh, maybe he's 50-50, he could come back. You know, I could be completely wrong here. It just seems like to me this is probably it for Javon, at least at Missouri. I think if he takes one more year, it'll probably be somewhere else, especially with Cuonzo Martin's status up in the air. That could have a lot to do with it as well. But again, regardless, nice to see Missouri get a win despite, wow, what a terrible start by the Tigers and a heck of a start for the Bulldogs. I believe they made their first 10 shots, if not 10 of the first 11 or so. And yeah, just a stunningly bad start offensively too. Just typical turnovers in the half court. Why Georgia just didn't trap us at the half court all game, and really why all opponents don't do that to Missouri is really beyond my ability to comprehend, because there's really not a big answer there. But fortunately, Boogie Coleman was able to settle down a bit in the second half and start playing a little bit more at his game. And certainly Georgia, not a good team, especially defensively. But I also thought the Cook kid, sorry, I don't have his first name right at the tip of my tongue here, but man, he was just dominating the ball way too much. That was a big time problem for the Bulldogs, I thought. And by the way, the Abdur-Rahim kid, Sharif Abdur-Rahim's son, once again, all these basketball players from the 90s that now have kids that are playing college basketball. Stop making me feel old. But, you know, most importantly, though, I thought, here's one thing I'll nitpick a little bit. You guys know I love Trevin Brazile, right? Well, here I'll nitpick him a little bit and say that his one-on-one defense needs a little bit of work. If you get him in space, he can be exploited a little bit off the dribble. Having said that, I think it's a really, really great sign that his rebounding has really taken an uptick here over the last few games, especially on the defensive end of the floor. If he can help control the glass almost as well as he can protect the rim as a help side defender, a weak side defender, and of course, he's such a good lob player too offensively, and he can knock down a three as he showed yesterday as well. We got something special in this kid, quite possibly. But again, somebody who is basically a guard that's still growing into his body now at 6'9". It's just a really good sign to me that he's starting to crash the boards a little harder. Now, one thing that I will note that may only be interesting to me, quite honestly, but I'll say, let's not make too much of this. But one thing that was interesting to me is that Desiree Francois, of course, Missouri's athletic director, well, she's often front and center. We see her face a lot at just about any major Missouri athletics event. Certainly that was the case. You saw her sitting front row on the camera side of the court down in Nashville for Missouri's loss to Arkansas in the women's SEC basketball tournament. But of course, you saw her yesterday with Javon Pickett. But then after that, it wasn't as though you saw her sitting directly behind Konzo Martin or anything like that. In fact, it just so happened that she sat in the middle section, just 4 rows, literally exactly 4 rows right in front of myself, up in the yellow seats, the gold seats in the upper bowl. That's where I sit in that middle section. Well, that's where Desiree Francois found herself for at least the first 8 minutes of the game or so. And I just thought it was interesting that, I don't know, she was just sitting by herself, taking the game in, obviously cheering a little bit, but it wasn't as though she was making a big public show of support for Konzo Martin. Again, let's not make too much of this, but just thought it was interesting that, to me, the vibe I was getting is, hey, that whole thing is still up in the air. And, well, that's the vibe you're getting from the Missouri beat as well. So obviously in a week or so, maybe 2, we'll probably find something out if Konzo's coming back or not. And coming up, Robin Pingeton had her explanation for why Aijha Blackwell's minutes were so limited in the Tigers' first round loss to Arkansas down in Nashville. Also want to get to some football as well, including Tyler Beatty at the Combine. But first, I want to tell you about Stat Hero. And man, March Madness is such a great time of year. And honestly, occasionally I actually cash in, win a bracket, do something good like that. But you know what? Some days, some years, we all just flame out, right? No matter how good you are at this kind of stuff. Well, I'm hedging my bets this year with Stat Heroes NCAA Pick'em contest. You see, Stat Heroes NCAA single game Pick'ems pit the star players against each other in an amazing hybrid of fantasy and sports gambling. Take control back from those dreaded handicappers that always seem to have the edge. Am I right? So start focusing on the players you know best with gameplay that doesn't rely on big spreads, long odds, or funky props. This is truly what fantasy was meant to be. So sign up for free right now at stathero.com/lockedon. And your promo code's also locked on for a 100% deposit match. That's stathero.com/lockedon. Promo code locked on. Terms and conditions apply. And by Run Your Pool. And yes, of course, March Madness just a couple weeks away. That means if you're doing a traditional pool, or maybe a different type of pool, maybe you're into Survivor like I am, well, guess what? Run Your Pool is the best way to go. Don't go with the usual, go with the best, and that is Run Your Pool. They have stuff that you won't find at ESPN or CBS, more intel, better intel, even better. So you know what? If you've got a business too, by the way, Run Your Pool can help take some of that madness magic and play alongside your employees, or even gain customers. Well, you know what? Also, we clearly believe Run Your Pool is the best way to go, because that's how we're doing it. Locked On. Join us at runyourpool.com/lockedon. And while you're there, create your own pool for your family, your friends, your business, whatever it might be. Enter Pure Madness at checkout for $10 off your custom pool. That's runyourpool.com/lockedon for your chance to win a cash prize. Now, if you listen to my previous episode, you'll know that I was definitely critical of Robin Pingeton and her decision to limit Aijha Blackwell to just 11 minutes in Missouri's loss to Arkansas. Well, to be fair to Coach Pingeton, obviously she's the head coach. She knows a lot more about the situation and her squad than I do. There's no doubt about that. And maybe there's more to Blackwell's situation than a simple possession charge. Again, I don't know. I'm not in that locker room. But to me, man, if she can play, then you just got to play her. If you're making the decision to play your best player, well, then play her, for God's sakes. But you know what? Here was Pingeton's, at least part of her explanation. She said, quote, "I don't know if I think it's really fair to the other players to change something after not being with the team for 7 days. That's a challenging call for a coach." And again, with all due respect to Coach Pingeton, I just have to really strongly disagree there. I don't think that's a challenging call. You know what was a challenging call? Michael Porter Jr. for Conzo Martin. When MPJ came back at the very end, not even at the end of the regular season, at the very beginning of the postseason, he plays one game against Texas A&M. We go out and we lose. And then, of course, one game of March Madness against Florida State. Well, we go out and lose that game too. That was a guy who had, for all intents and purposes, not played the entire season. But he's such a talent. Well, obviously, you want to have him in. That was a challenge in order to figure out how to best use that guy. That's not the situation with Aijha Blackwell. Aijha Blackwell has been on this team the entire season. And yes, while she happened to miss the South Carolina game, I believe with COVID protocols, yeah, okay, you won that game without her. That's a coincidence, folks. You're not better off without Aijha Blackwell, number one. And number two, I'm sorry, that explanation just doesn't make a lot of sense. So you practice for a week without Aijha Blackwell, and suddenly, oh, the whole team has just changed. I'm sorry, I think that's ridiculous. And also, it also allowed for the other team, Arkansas, to focus a lot more of their attention on gals like Haley Frank and Lauren Hansen instead of Aijha. And again, in just 11 minutes, Aijha gets 8 rebounds. That alone was making a huge difference in the ball game. So to me, that explanation just didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But perhaps you want to disagree with me. But you know what? Let's move on to football here a little bit. This is going to be a quick edition of Locked On Mizzou, special weekend edition. But I do want to talk football here just a little bit. A little bit surprisingly to me, still no word on what Jayden Daniels is doing, the Arizona State quarterback for the last 3 seasons who's entered his name into the transfer portal. We know he visited Columbia. We know he was on campus about a week ago now. Well, at this point, even if he says right now, as I'm recording this podcast, hey, I'm going to Missouri, well, you're looking at maybe half of the spring at best. To me, I don't know. You either got to be in or you got to be out. At this point, again, if we're going to ding Sam Horn for not being here for spring practice because he's playing high school baseball still, well, it has to affect Jayden Daniels a little bit too, despite the fact that obviously he has experience and quite a bit of experience at the major college football level. But to me, again, this just gives me more reason to stick with my initial gut reaction, which was, hey, I'd kind of like to see Brady Cook get this job. Well, after I've done more homework, I still think we should stick with Brady Cook more likely than not. And the longer this drags out, the longer it goes that Jayden Daniels isn't on campus at Missouri, the more I'm leaning toward Brady Cook. That's just me. Now, also speaking of the transfer portal, for a long time, speaking of a guy who we thought was going to be on campus, a guy who had enrolled in classes at Missouri, in fact, well, Marquise Robinson, defensive lineman, Auburn. At this point, it's looking real unlikely he's going to come to Missouri. He's still at Auburn. I really don't know what's up with Marquise, but at this point, all the reporting is that it's not looking likely. And I think we could probably figure that out, right? If he's not actually taking classes at this point, well, how in the world is he going to be eligible? And how do we even know that he wants to be here? So a really sort of bizarre thing there to me, but it looks like the Marquise Robinson saga is going to come to kind of an anticlimactic ending if you're a Missouri fan. But one final note, by the way, Tyler Beatty with an official 4.45 40-yard dash at the NFL Combine. And I got to say, that's a pretty good number for Tyler. If he's not a 4th or 5th round pick, I think somebody's making a mistake. Maybe he could even get into the 3rd round. I think 5th round at worst for Beatty to me. Anything worse than that, I think the NFL is making a huge mistake if they just think, well, he's a little bit shorter than we'd like, ideally. That's a dumb reason to not take a guy who, to me, could be a really, really solid player for a long time. Kind of reminds me of a slightly shorter Jerick McKinnon of the Kansas City Chiefs a little bit. So you know what? Let's call it a day on this edition of Locked On Mizzou. Thank you all for joining me. As always, just wanted to get you a quick podcast here on Sunday since I promised you 5 last week. Fell just 1 episode short, so I figured let's get some bonus content for all of you, my loyal listeners, and all you new listeners as well. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for making us your first listen. Appreciate y'all very, very much. So until next time, I am John Miller, and this has been Locked on Mizzou.